This is part two to our lecture on culture. So if you haven't watched part one, make sure you watch it. So I think where I left off was can't go back here. So well, regardless, now it's important to discuss race here. Race and tie in connection with culture. So for anthropologists and sociologists, they understand race as culturally constructed. I'll move this. So here, different racial categories can be constructed by applying different criteria. In other words, there is no objective way to determine whether some population should be considered a separate race or grouped with other populations into a single racial type and how many human races exist. Different cultures identify different numbers and kinds of races, raising doubts about the biological realities of any given cultural racial categories. Last to note here is even within a single society or nation, the definition of race changes over time and has historically changed. So, take some time, think about it, and reflect upon how you define race. So take some time, take like a notebook or whatever. If you're in anthropology, take your field journal and write this down. But define race for me. How do you define race? What does race mean? And does your definition align with the textbook definition, as well as other definitions that you are finding online, like sociological definitions, anthropological definitions? Does your definition align with that? And how does it differ? And in what ways? So take some time, write down the definition. But what's important here to note is that race is socially and culturally constructed. We have, stated differently, historically constructed the term over the years. And race also did not always mean skin color. And it wasn't always in reference to skin color. Historically speaking, it was primarily used early on before anthropologists attached the definition of skin color to race. Before that, it was primarily used to define different categories of plants. And that's what race was in reference to until anthropologists attached it to the definition of skin color. What's also important to note is that race shifted from being biologically defined and socially defined to primarily being socially and culturally defined now by sociologists and anthropologists. Biology has little to no relevancy to race here, for a lot of the social sciences and natural sciences. Because historically speaking, it's also important to note here, when biology was attached to race, it it kind of led to the um, practice of scientific racism, where certain beliefs became scientific knowledge about racial groups. In reality, it was just pseudoscience or fake science. For example, the fact that Black people do not get sunburns, and therefore don't need to have sunscreen. That is a pseudoscience, and it's not based in reality, in other words. And so for sociologists and anthropologists, they really take a lot of time to deconstruct historical definitions of race here and how it might be and how those definitions, how they have been harmful to certain groups and populations. So, I don't know where I went. And it's there. Okay, cool. Don't know why it's doing that. Okay, I think that should be now you're seeing the screen. Oopsie. Oh well. So this is an example of how race has been socially and culturally constructed over the years, right? How we went from having three categories for race, historically speaking, in the census report. Either you were white, you were black, or or uh or you were a white and free, or you were black and free. They did not consider slaves um, during colonial times as citizens and did not consider them as human beings, and did not categorize them as such with this definition of the consensus report, which is very interesting. But it also shows how race and the definition of race has isolated and left out groups of people. Because again, you were either by these early definitions of race, white or black. If you were mixed, you were black. Even 1% of the drop of black blood made you black in that case. Um, and and then we also see so modern definitions of race, especially in the census report, establish there are establish that there are several, many different racial categories here. And it's not just one that people might be a part of. They might be mixed, they might be black, they might be Hispanic, they might be Indian, Asian, the list goes on here, right? So again, it's more broad, it's more complex here, an understanding of what race is. Worldview is an important definition. It is defined as the ways in which people interpret reality and events, including how they see themselves relating to the world around them and how they relate to other people around them. Um, Cultural shock is the disorientation, and I'm kind of going through some major definitions here. The disorientation that people experience or they might experience when they come in contact with a fundamentally different part of culture and can no longer depend on their taken for granted assumptions about life. Stated differently, you might experience cultural shock when you come in contact with a culture that is completely different than the one that you grew up with. Um, my students who weren't born in America came to America, visited it, and took classes here. For those students, the first thing that they noted that was shocking about our culture here in America was grocery stores. And the fact that we have so many options in grocery stores, and especially so many vibrant colors within grocery stores. And our aisles are super, super big. And we also have super big portion sizes here in America. And for those students, they told me this and they noted that was like very shocking to them coming over and seeing that within grocery stores. And so that's one example of this, what you might experience, what you might go through in a new location, in a new culture, right? But again, it's a common disorientating feeling that you might go through when you travel somewhere. Cultural diffusion is the spread of cultural traits from one group to another. It includes both material and non-material cultural traits. This is one way to how culture is passed to different groups of people, or how it can be transmitted to different types of people and different groups. And so it's also how this cultural diffusion is also getting at the fact that culture spreads, and it can spread. Something that kind of gets picked up. For example, different trends that are cultural trends tend to spread and spread across different regions and different areas and different locations and different countries. And those become almost universal and can become universal. And so consider what some examples might be here. Have you seen any cultural traits being spread? What does that look like, right? An example here would be trends, right? So go and consider the direction of trends here and how there might be cultural trends that are spread from group to group. Cultural leveling is a process where cultures become more and more similar to one another. And again, with the last one, cultural infusion, now cultural leveling, what are some examples of this? How have you seen cultures become more similar to one another? In what ways have you seen this? A good example of cultural diffusion and cultural leveling here, if you can't think about it, and take a pause to the video if you want to, before I give this example. But a good example of this would be Chinatown here in America, and how certain cities have Chinatown. That's one culture being taken and applied to American culture and specific to American neighborhoods, right? And we even see this with particular markets and supermarkets and the like. But Chinatown is one example of that you might see, an example of cultural leveling. So, culture is necessary for human existence in at least three specific ways. This is discussed primarily in my anthropology textbook, but we adapt to our natural environments through cultural knowledge. And cultural knowledge helps us fit in and adapt, right? Because we learn that cultural knowledge, we become a part of it, in other words. Number two, culture provides a basis for human life and existence. It kind of becomes our whole life, our identity, who we are, is found within our culture. And then third, we construct our reality through culture. We start to navigate life through our culture. Again, culture is a lens here, which is important. Cultural determinism posits that culture determines or dictates our behavior in many ways. And cultural determinism takes it a step further to say that that is determined behavior, that we are determined to act that way because of our culture. It kind of predicts our behavior in that instance. Culture does shape individuals, but individuals can simultaneously shape culture. And so with that, culture can be changed and modified. It can be rewritten. It can be it can be changed again, over and over and over again. If we don't like a part of our culture, we could change that. We can revise that. We can make something new out of that. And that's often seen. Specifically, how individuals have shaped culture. We have seen this during the 1960s and 1970s through several and many social movements. That's just one example of this. So take some time, reflect upon these questions. Does our culture determine what choices we make? Can our choices influence the culture we are a part of? Okay, so if you remember, I briefly discussed biology here, especially when discussing race and how race has been defined. And when I talk about race in the following weeks, I'll expand upon that. But humans are special animals, especially to anthropologists, because we rely heavily on culture. If we don't have a culture, we aren't tied to anything. And further, we aren't tied to other people. We can become disconnected in many ways. And that's what anthropologists highlight about culture, is that culture keeps us tied to other people within our society. Biological determinism is the idea that um, biologically and genetically, inherited differences between populations are important influences on cultural differences between them. It's important to note that anthropologists and sociologists disagree with biological determinism. But that being said, early anthropologists in the field did apply biological determinism in a lot of their writing. Of course, that's not the case anymore, but it's important to note that historical significance of how anthropology started, and how it started in a rocky manner, with kind of centering biological determinism here, as well as we saw early sociologists and anthropologists also practicing social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the notion that competition between individuals and groups produces losers as well as winners here, due to the natural or inherent characteristics of both. Social Darwinism and biological determinism here led to particular events in our history, particular devastating events in our history, referring to colonialism, genocide, slavery, and the eugenics movement. If so, going through it, I will define the terms eugenics, genocide, slavery in the later weeks. What I want to get out of the way with first and foremost is most students know the terms that I mentioned before: colonialism, genocide, slavery. They do not know sometimes what I mean when I say eugenics movement. So with each of these, we have seen historically speaking, populations being controlled through a number of means, albeit whether it be through the killing or genocide of that population, so controlling them through that aspect, or free slavery, so controlling their labor and how much labor they produce. That has been seen in America with slavery. Colonialism ties into the slavery process and the labor process. Or we have also seen the controlling of fertilization and population density and size with specific groups. And that is in connection with the eugenics movement, where groups of people, historically speaking, Hispanic people, Black people alike, were sterilized and intentionally sterilized by doctors. America did this, France did this, and a number of other different regions and countries did this practice of the eugenics movement for a long time. And it was a particular movement that was not only traumatizing, but it completely impacted, negatively impacted groups of people for years to come. So again, if you don't know much about the eugenics movement, that's okay. It's not often taught, unfortunately, in history classes. But I have a series of videos. There's one that TED Talk, TED Ed does on YouTube on the eugenics movement that is really well done and goes through the history of the eugenics movement. So if you want more information on that, there's this resource. Again, last to note here is that anthropologists, sociologists reject biological determinism and social Darwinism. They do not agree with these fields of, it's not even considered to them research because it's not research. And it's what's led to scientific racism. Okay, folkways, mores, and taboos are important terms to anthropologists and sociologists in understanding cultures. So, folkway is norms not strictly enforced. For example, the aspect of shaking one's hand when you meet them, right? Or waving to a person when you're greeting them, right? That is a folkway. It is a norm that's not, you don't necessarily have to wave to someone or smile at someone or shake someone's hand after you compete a match, right? But it's sort of an expectation. It's a norm, right? It seems natural. It seems polite, in other words. And so that's a folkway, not an expectation, but it's still nonetheless a norm that's expected within a social setting. Mores here is widely observed norms with great significance, i.e., morals. Morals and mores tie together here. As opposed to taboos. Taboo is a norm that is strictly ingrained, that even the thought of, not strictly, strongly ingrained, and that even the thought of breaking it is met with revulsion. A taboo here is something that, for example, we have seen from culture to culture, historically speaking, the aspect of incest being taboo and treated as taboo, something wrong. And something that even the aspect of incest and seeing it is met with revulsion. The same with murder, seen from culture to culture, that the aspect of killing without any reason is met with revulsion, historically speaking. So those two, or three, rather. Last to discuss here are cultural universals. Cultural universals include universal values, norms, and cultural traits. George Murdoch essentially wanted to understand whether or not there were universal cultural practices, norms, and values. And so to do this, he went from culture to culture around the world and recorded their values, norms, and behaviors and cultural traits. What he found was that there are universal activities found in many cultures, but there are different customs in how they approach these universal activities. For example, he found from culture to culture, universally, we have wedding rituals, we have marriage rituals. That is seen from culture to culture, recorded across centuries, right? But we see different customs and approaches from culture to culture and how they define marriage and what people wear, because it's not universal that brides wear white dresses. It's not universal that grooms wear suits, right? So that changes from culture to culture, and those specific customs shift from culture to culture there. That's just one example. Another example is funerals. Every culture has specific universal activities in how they bury their dead. The customs differ, though, in how they do that and how they treat their dead. And this is again seen from culture to culture how it differs, right? Where it might be common practice to cremate your loved ones versus bury them, right? Or it might be common practice um to bury gifts alongside your loved ones once they pass, right? So they still have those gifts into the afterlife, right? Like we saw with Egypt. Um, and so you might see those different customs and practices, but that's specific to that culture and not seen from other cultures. And this is a full list of different, cultural universals. So culturally universal, uh, for example, games, sports, and other kinds of recreational activities have been reported for centuries and found across cultures. Arts have been reported for centuries, found across many cultures, if not all cultures, have their own forms of arts here. Singing and other forms of music found from culture to culture. But again, it's unique in what they consider to be artistic or valuable and what they like listening to. That changes from culture to culture. Myths, legends, folklores change from culture to culture. Um, the list goes on here. Okay, so I have some videos here at the end. Um, Let me pull them up again. For if you want to know more about the eugenics movement, there's this great video on YouTube discussing it. There's also a good video that ties the to the eugenic movement in reference to IQ tests and how IQ tests function, historically speaking. Um, as well as there's this video, it's posted to Canvas. Trying to remember oh, it's how culture drives behavior. So make sure you watch this video. It's a very fascinating video. It's a good TED Talk, brief TED Talk. So get back to okay. So stop sharing. All right. Well, that's pretty much it for the week on culture. So let me know if you have any questions. So I'll see you later. Bye.